Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcs, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 2, I'm going to be talking to 8 South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today, we talk to Yudhanjaya Wijeratne, science fiction author, data scientist, and researcher, the author of Numbercaste, the Commonwealth Empire series, and the Salvage Crew. He's also the co-founder of Watchdog, a fact-checking organization created to counteract misinformation and propaganda in Sri Lanka. We discuss AI, his non-traditional road to publication, colonialism, space economics, the horrors of reality TV, and poetry. You can follow Yudhanjaya on Twitter at Yudhanjaya. Hi, Yudhanjaya. Thank you so much for joining us today on ARCS.
Well, thank you for having me.
And to kind of get things started, could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? How did you get started? Did you always want to be one?
Yeah, well, I guess I always wanted to be a writer because I always thought of myself as a writer. And in fact, I don't know how she has this, but my mum still has a short story that I wrote somewhere in like grade 2 or something. And we were all tasked with writing essays, and I ended up writing a story from the perspective of a hungry, starving stray dog. And I said, I'm a stray dog. I like nobody and nobody likes me. And then the teachers are obviously quite concerned. And they summoned my parents and asked, is everything all right at home? You know, this is not normal for a child. And Ammi still collects all of those things. I swear she's carting around like mountains of completely useless paper. But I always thought of myself as a writer. So when I dropped out of A-levels, and I had to drop out because at the time our family was going through very hard financial times, and university was never going to happen. And it was just my mom and me, and we both had to work to put food on the table. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm working in retail. I'm 18 years old. The world kind of looks like a dark and terrifying place. And if you don't have a degree, I'm going to end up having to sell drugs at some point. But I told myself I would keep writing. And I had a blog that I would pay like 60 rupees at the end of the week to go to an internet cafe for an hour and upload stuff that I had typed in Notepad. And I kept writing and I kept blogging and I kept reading. And how I sort of actually got something published was sometime in 2016 or so, I had decided that I was going to write a book. And I was actually going to sit down and finish writing a book. And come 2017, I had changed jobs. I had a fairly successful career as a tech journalist. So I had some confidence in myself, at least that I could write. And I found myself in 2017 sitting on this Word document that happened to have the end typed at it, and that was Numbercaste. And then I started taking it to publishers in Sri Lanka. And pretty much everyone I spoke to said, yeah, this is science fiction. We don't do that here. And I wasn't crushed, I think, because at that point I had proven to myself that I could finish something that I started. And I think that was more important to me than even publishing the book. So I told myself that, okay, if this is not going to be published, and I didn't want to go into vanity publishing, I said I'm going to get this out to people who will actually read the damn thing. And if local publishers weren't going to work, then I decided that I would spend some time figuring out how Amazon worked. And in 2017, to get a feel for it, I published a short story called The Slow Sad Suicide of Rohan Wijeratne. And it was about an alcoholic who signs up to be shot into a curse singularity. And it was sort of meant to be a bit trippy as well. And I published it. I put it out. By this point, I had taught myself graphic design, and I made the best cover that I could. And I put it out and thought, okay, let's see if this goes somewhere. And surprisingly, it did. I didn't expect as many people, even Sri Lankans, to read it and go, wow, okay, this is awesome. Hey, what are you writing next? When's the next thing coming out? And then I basically went, aha, I have a thing, and it now has a cover, and now I've learned actually how to fiddle with this particular interface. And I published it, and that was Numbercaste. And it ended up getting on the hard science fiction bestsellers list globally. And at that point, HarperCollins came calling. My agent was in the Indian subcontinent, Kanishka Gupta. And at that point, my understanding is a whole bunch of people read it, and HarperCollins basically came knocking and said, hey, we see you like to write. Would you like to write 5? And I said, yes, absolutely. So I got a 5-book deal out of that. And by 2018, mid, people were writing about Numbercaste and saying, hey, this guy seems to have predicted what China's up to with the credit score. I wasn't doing any predictions. I actually knew a whole bunch of journalists who had been talking about these things in China for a very long time. And I knew enough that I could actually look at those systems. I was working in a large tech company at the time, and I knew enough to sort of build this kind of fictional system in the book. And 2018 mid, the publishing offer's on the table, and I'm sitting there behind a Word document going, oh, okay, cool. Wow, now we have to do this again.
I think that's a theme through most of your books. There's bits, especially in the Common Peace trilogy, where I'm just like, oh, okay, that's a little too close to home. I mean, I'm sure in Numbercaste, people saw it a lot more evidently, but definitely, especially the first book, as I was reading it, I was like, ouch, okay.
Right. I think, though, the most hilarious of those incidents actually happened recently. I wrote a book that was called Once Upon a Time in Colombo. It's called The Wretched and the Damned because Once Upon a Time in Colombo is a really good name, and someone took that title for a TV series. And I was like, oh, yes. I was like, oh, damn it. But, good for them. So I changed the title, and I wrote this sometime during COVID. I was stuck at home. I was slowly losing my mind, and I was trying to bargain for cigarettes and carrots. And it felt like I was doing serious drug deals because, the government had enforced very tight quarantine. Police were shooting at cars that were breaking sort of quarantine and curfew rules. So I wrote a story about a bunch of superpowered heroes, anti-heroes, taking down the government of Sri Lanka. And they do it by basically triggering an economic collapse. And as the government sort of goes into mayhem, the president does increasingly stupid stuff like hiring astrologers to be a sort of budget surveillance state. Like Sri Lanka doesn't have the money for CCTV and software anymore. So you just put astrologers in every government department and say, you got to predict what will happen.
That is also just too close to home.
Point is, this actually happened, right? So in March last year, the Sri Lankan economy had completely collapsed. It's still in soft collapse. There were riots on the street. We were chasing the president out. And I was in the middle of that mob going into the presidential secretariat on my push bike. I had gone out to buy bread and ended up cycling all the way to the presidential secretariat. And I was thinking, oh, no. God damn it. This is not how it should have been. And at that point, I was like, I've failed at writing fiction. I've just written reality with the serial numbers filed off. And actual reality was a lot more interesting.
I can't wait for this to turn up in one of your books. It has to, because who goes out for bread and follows along on this kind of adventure? Though I feel like we could talk about this for a long time, I also wanted to ask you about your influences as a storyteller. Were there any particular books or movies or, TV shows, media in general, that influenced you as a writer?
So this is pretty weird, right? Because I read a lot of fantasy, and I love Terry Pratchett. I love the Discworld. I love Stephen King's Dark Tower. I distinctly remember being 14 or 15 and reading The Wolves of the Kala. And in the foreword, Stephen King talks about being 19 and seeing this amazing movie, being struck by the gunslinger, and that turning into the seed, him deciding that he's going to write a book that's more epic than Tolkien, and he's going to do this at the age of 19. Phenomenal hubris. And I thought to myself, well, if he can do it, well, so can I. And I actually wrote a book. It's 138,000 words. It will never see the light of day because it's absolute trash. And it's written entirely in Comic Sans, so you can understand how terrible this is. But a lot of my current inspirations, if you will, things that are very, very interesting to me right now, Dark Souls. It's a video game series, and it's from Software. It is a post-apocalypse fantasy landscape. Then there is this sense of epicness, this vastness, but also in the way of a lot of good Japanese games, there's a certain difference to it. A lot of Western fantasy sometimes gets overly preoccupied with the systems underlying the magic, the world building, so to speak, and making sure that all the bits line up. With Dark Souls, it's about theme, it's about feeling, it's about these tremendous stories that you as a reader, or you as a player rather, are playing from the perspective of like basically the bottom of the undead rat pack. And there are creatures and things and places that you come across that are so much more glorious, so much more epic, so much more wilder than anything you've done to date. And it really gives a sense of the tragedy of this beautiful civilization that has collapsed and then collapsed on itself again. It's incredible. So a lot of that is finding its way into the stuff that I'm working on now. For stuff that you've liked, the Commonwealth Empires, there's a lot of Battle Royale in there. There's also a certain amount of Bioshock in there, and System Shock as well. So video games have consistently been a source of incredible inspiration for me. Final Fantasy VII, I remember installing it and then formatting my computer multiple times to get it to work, and it really opened my eyes to the kind of scale of stories that you could tell back when I was a kid. And other games like Ahriman's Prophecy, Avion, this idea of immersion, the idea of fully embedding someone in a world that is very different from ours, but feels real, sometimes uncomfortably so. That's something I think that I got from video games.
So I want to move on to discussing the Salvage Crew, but before we do that, I also want to invite you to do a reading and maybe give our listeners a little bit of a summary about the book so they have context for what they're hearing.
Okay. So The Salvage Crew is a book that I wrote as stress relief, if you will. I was procrastinating on something that I was supposed to be working on, and procrastination was writing another book. So I wanted to write a story about a machine intelligence, and I wanted to have fun with it. And I went into it thinking, okay, I've written books, I've short stories, I've explored the nature of the sort of interface between human and AI and all the profound ways that our world might change. But really, I'm just writing about it, right? I'm not actually doing much about it. So I thought, all right, what if I actually use various systems to co-write with? So I wrote a galaxy generator, which was surprisingly simpler than I expected. Like, the distributions of stars, and you can set up like planets that form around stars, and then some of these planets spawn civilizations and they go on to fight and then, declare zones and so on. I set up weather simulators for a particular planet. I set up a character creator, and the voice of this machine poet, who was my central character, I downloaded OpenAI's GPT-2, which was sort of cutting edge at the time. I retrained it on Tang Dynasty poetry, and I got it essentially to become a machine poet. It was kind of stunted for general purposes after that, but it was a competent poet in that style, I'd say. And the intention was to have something that was ever so slightly off, like to have that really machine feeling to the poetry. And I wrote a book with it. And it was a book about basically a sea team of salvage operators being dropshipped onto a planet, being told to salvage this downed UN ship that had, broken apart on the planet's surface. They're a sea team. Nobody really cares about them. They're sort of on the worst possible end of an intergalactic gig economy, if you will. And their lives are hell. And they land on this thing and they discover that maybe we aren't alone in the universe after all. So the whole story is written from the point of the overseer, OC, Amber Rose, who once was a person but now is still a person in a machine body. And their payoff is, if they find a planet that they actually like, they have the freedom to make a copy of themselves and send that copy off to the next gig while they stay back and enjoy the rest, until the metal rusts. They can at least enjoy one last sunset. And that's sort of the payoff that they're working towards. So it starts with chapter 1. I want to make one thing clear. I did not, repeat, not ask for any of this. I did not ask to be promoted, I did not ask to be made overseer, and I certainly did not ask to be strapped down in this tin can body of a drop pod, hurtling down with 3 idiots screaming their lungs out inside of me. So the company promised me an A-team. You know, the kind of people Joe Haldeman wrote about in The Forever War. Astrophysicists who could blow a man's head off at 500 meters. The best of the best, the Master Chiefs and all that. The kind of people who go in, get shit done, leave a calling card, and strike a heroic pose in the bargain. Did we get what it said on the label? Well, let's take a look around. Exhibit A, Simon Houston. Simon is my geologist. 35-ish in biological time and looks like someone stuck eyeballs on a mop. They told me Simon would be reliable. He's good at everything to do with rocks and earthquakes. He's scored well in the shooting sims, can do CPR and basic medical aid and kind of looks like your average nerd trying too hard to be cool. They said he'll make a fine crew member, but here's what they didn't tell me. Simon grew up on the brutal world of old New York. He was sold to a corporation as a child. They stuck a needle into the center of his brainstem and jacked him into a virtual fantasy world so they could broadcast his feed as reality TV. His entire childhood was spent getting beaten up by gangs and digging holes in fake ground so nobody could hear him crying in fake darkness. Except for the audience, of course, who must have had a hoot, the sick bastards. And old New York, really had its times. After the Mercator-Rizek rebellion, the UN jumped in and did a number on them, and they yanked all those poor souls out of reality TV and set them free. But for some reason, I don't think this man ever really recovered. Now, I'm not saying Simon is a bad person. I'm saying what doesn't kill you makes you stranger. I'm saying a traumatized reality TV slave star is the last person I want dropped onto an unexplored planet on my first landing mission. Exhibit B, Anna Agrawal. Anna's an odd fish, right? She's got 20 years on Simon. But unlike Simon, Anna grew up with everything she ever wanted. I've checked her degree transcripts, the through-the-roof, high social skills, and then somewhere along the line she decides to ditch everything and become an army doctor. Doesn't compute. You know why it doesn't compute? Because Anna Agrawal doesn't exist. I don't know who the hell this person is, but the real Anna, as verified by her gene sample, died on the microplanet Wayward Child. This imposter, let's call her fake Anna, showed up on Arjuna 3 and has been hopping planets ever since, always moving outwards. Deus Olympus, boat murdered, Kartika Highway. This kind of stuff is real easy when delays between databases are measured in light years. Fake Anna picked up a gunshot wound somewhere on the way, left leg, and now she's on my mission on the very edge of human space. Right now, she's cradling Simon as he screams, which, excuse me Anna, is the stupidest fucking thing you can do while strapped inside a tin can plummeting through the atmosphere. God damn it, Anna, go back to your seat. Everybody just shut up and go back to your seat.
I have to admit that when I read that for the first time, I laughed out loud because that would have been my exact reaction. Why on earth are you holding him?
Yes, yes. This is what I wanted to write. And it's a sort of South Asian twist on the space colonization thing because, if we were sending missions like these, there's definitely going to be someone going, oh, God damn it, why did they give me these idiots? It's not going to be the square-jawed hero saying, sir, yes, sir. It's going to be a bunch of screw-ups somewhere and somebody wanted to get rid of them.
This book is set on a seemingly uninhabited planet, which has been terraformed but not colonized. The characters are members of a small salvage crew who are there simply to find and retrieve whatever valuables they can find. So why a salvage crew as the main characters? They're clearly misfits on the fringes of society.
Because it's fun to write about the misfits. And I don't find it particularly fun to write about people who've had their sort of lives handed to them on a silver platter. And to an extent, I can't, I have difficulty empathizing with that existence as well. I don't think there's a story necessarily like in a lot of 50s and 60s science fiction, the so-called golden age. I beg to differ with this, but in a lot of that, you have heroes who are expert scientists and can shoot someone's head off and like wear power armor, who knows how to make a martini. I don't really find it fun to write about or think about those types of people because those types of people are, I hate to say even one in a lifetime, I've not met those types of people ever. everyone I've met, worked with, talked to has some kind of trauma, has always had some kind of trauma in their past. Nobody has a perfectly glossy life, even if it looks like that from the outside. And I always found it more interesting to write about people who are not well suited to their environment or the challenges they found themselves in, but are trying, and they're trying their best, and they're doing what they can to survive.
I don't know what it says about me, but Simon is actually my favorite character in the book.
Okay. You have issues.
Definitely. We'll come to that later. But the premise is that humans have fled to the stars and started colonizing them, discarding everything that doesn't suit their needs. Corporations rule the roost, and capitalism has followed mankind into the cosmos. Could you tell me a bit about your world building process? How did you kind of set this up?
Sure. So my general process has actually changed quite a lot over the years. Initially, like when I was writing Numbercaste, I always use what tools I have on hand. So when I was writing Numbercaste, I had never written fiction before. And what I knew from working in tech were flowcharts, web sequence diagrams. So that's how I sort of structured the whole thing. And I set it up from this premise of what if, and then I kept exploring different branches of a decision tree and going, not that, we'll go with this. With, I think, post Inhuman Race, I had sort of settled into this idea that a book appears in pieces. I spot an interesting idea, and a little bit like an intellectual crow, if I see a shiny idea, I take it and I steal it and I put it in a back pocket somewhere. And over time, I keep gathering bits and pieces of this. And I'm tremendously ADHD in how I do this. And I keep finding all sorts of random rabbit holes and disappearing down them for like 3-4 days. And then there are like a whole bunch of missed calls and people asking, hey, why the hell aren't you responding to my messages? What's wrong with your email? But I disappear down these rabbit holes and I find pieces that seem to fit. So with the Salvage Crew, it was, I want to explore this idea of a bunch of misfits. I want to explore this idea of AI and this permeable barrier between what we consider to be humanity and what we would consider to be artificial intelligence. Like the idea that intelligence of all sorts may be both tremendously artificial and not have the same time. And at the same time, I had in mind this very Wittgensteinian theory of intelligence, if you will. Like, this is spoilers, but like one of the core components of the plot is that the alien intelligence, who actually happens to be most of the planet that they're on, it's not really interested in whether you can make spaceships and, really nice shiny metal things. Its definition of intelligence is, are these creatures playing the language game? Are they performing symbol manipulation and trying to create these abstract concepts and talk about both their interiors as well as the universe around them? In short, are they writing poetry? Are they writing fiction? That's its definition for intelligence, because it's very old. It's seen civilizations come and go. It's not really impressed, but if something is capable of even creating the crudest kind of art, it goes, oh, wow, I should go talk to these people. So I had these two things, and I also knew that I wanted to write a lot of my own tools, because as sort of being a fan of the games that I mentioned, I wanted to try my hand at creating my own pieces of a game, if you will. So the weather simulator is a bunch of Markov chains stapled together, the character creator, the galaxy generator, and so on. And I knew that I had to put these things together. So once I have enough density, if you will, I start looking for more ideas that make this initial group more interesting. So the whole space capitalism thing came about, was like, I didn't want to do faster than light travel in this universe. But then how do you run an economy? Because historically, your empires are always limited by communication. And you can expand into space, you're still going to have limits if you don't have faster than light travel. So I had to set up an economy that was based on software. Through quantum entanglement, you may not be able to send humans, but you can send bits. You have two entangled bits, one in one corner. A ship makes the long trip to plant another bit here. Both of them resonate, and now you can transmit data. Kind of really slow, but you can transmit data. So then what do? You can't send people, but you can digitize people and send them out as artificial intelligences to do your bidding. And that's where this sort of really extreme version of a colonialist gig economy really comes in, because a lot of government structures that are built on consensus and multi-stakeholderism really aren't going to function in this type of setting where communication is a key barrier and, actually getting people back and forth is a key barrier. By the time you make a decision from Earth, that other planet might have rebelled, it might have died, all sorts of things could have happened. So you have massive information asymmetry. So then this is like, once I figured out how the economy worked, that I just stapled that idea on and went, okay, this cluster looks interesting. And that's when I start writing. So I typically write like the first 10 to 15,000 words to see if I still have something. And if it is, is it a short story? Is it a novel? And if I can get an idea for the character and the texture and I'm like, okay, this is interesting, then I will go back and start laying out the beginning, middle, and end in as much detail as possible. And then I will start writing and work my way through these sort of milestones that I've set for myself. So it's not complete outlining. I've tried the Brandon Sanderson style, detailed outlining before. And I know a lot of people that it really works well for, but for my mind, if I've outlined something, I've kind of lost the impetus to discover the story and have a little bit of fun on the way. But if I try completely writing by the seat of my pants, I end up with a Word document and staring at it, and I have no idea what goes next. So I try to set up little milestones and guide markers for myself and say, okay, here are 2 bits of light, between them is darkness, and we're going to take a walk in the dark. That's very much how the Salvage Crew is written. That's pretty much how I do most of my writing now.
So you're planning pantser, basically.
I think, most people I think are somewhere in between. Like, I don't think there's a pure planner, except Brandon Sanderson, huge respect. I recently read Terry Pratchett's biography, and it turns out that the man might have actually been a pantser, or he's certainly not on the planner end of the spectrum. I think most people are somewhere in between.
I just read that too. And as I was reading it, I was like, of course you existed in chaos. This makes so much more sense.
Right, this makes so much sense. And you kept bees, of course. How else would you know that you have to tell the bees everything? Like, this is perfect. And it's so heartbreaking as well.
Oh, yeah. Back to the Salvage Crew, because if you get me started about Pratchett, we would be here for several hours. But the main narrator, who is Amber Rose, also known as the Overseer, who we spoke about earlier, is, as you mentioned, a human whose consciousness is now integrated into a computer. Why did you choose to go in that direction instead of a more traditional AI? There's this kind of root or sort of groundedness in humanity, which is quite evident in the narration of the book. And why was that important?
So the official textbook explanation is that creating a mind of this caliber, like even human level complexity, is still an extraordinarily difficult task for artificial intelligence. I mean, there's essentially millions of years of evolution that you're kind of trying to speed run. In some cases, it's accurate, but like ChatGPT, if you drop shipped it onto a planet and said, build a fortress, it's just going to wait there for an input prompt, right? We're not there. So the official explanation was like, it is cheaper once you have sufficient numbers of people who just digitize them. And presumably, if you keep their living conditions desperate enough, like Ambrose was at the start, they speak explicitly about being this offshoot Buddhist splinter sect of farmers that had a very tough life. You offer them a chance at seeing the rest of the world, they'll sign up and you can digitize the hell out of them, and now you have really cheap AI. And because it's human at the core, you can control it better. You know how humans tick. You have, again, thousands of years of organizational chain hierarchies, economics, psychology that you can use to actually control this thing that is now in a so many ton metal body. The unofficial reason is also because I considered it to be more interesting, because I've written about pure AI before, and like the state machine was one such. But to use something like that as a main character would have been very difficult, because I cannot conceive of a truly artificial intelligence that would be even remotely human in its desires or its reactions, and it would be something almost so difficult to empathize with. That's like the whole thrust behind the state machine, right? This thing is so alien. And even in Human Race, they make things that conspicuously look like humans, specifically like human children, because they want the audience to have empathy. So in that case, it was, or from a practical crafting perspective, it was a tactical choice of if I created something that you couldn't empathize with, I wouldn't be able to write from its perspective. And as a foil to that, I did create an intelligence that is truly alien. And you'll notice that even Amber Rose is terrified of this thing because there's this vast gap between them just in terms of how they think.
No, absolutely. And that's something that I noticed through the book. Like there's a lot of power dynamics between, Amber Rose and the crew and between the crew themselves. And of course, then we come up against Beacon, which is something that dwarfs even Amber Rose. This kind of shift in dynamics, which you see throughout the books, because initially there's a kind of almost like benign quality to Amber Rose, just trying to be friends with the crew. And then it slowly becomes slightly more militant and like trying to keep order.
Yes, as everything starts to spiral out of control, everybody starts showing a little bit of the worst side.
Exactly. Very survivor. And also then, there's the introduction of Shen, who is kind of a simpler AI, I would say, and is kind of questioning in his own way what Amber Rose is doing. And then as you think, oh, okay, Amber Rose is going to be the scariest thing about this book.
Then you come across Beacon, and Beacon is like, oh, dude, they really cut costs when they were making you. They're like, look at you, little wee thing. And it's like, oh, wow, you're like a pet. Can I poke at you?
I think that's how Beacon really views Amber Rose anyway. It's like, hey, you're like a really simplistic form of intelligence, but you're the best I've got right now.
Yeah, it's like, you've seen a stray cat and you're feeding it. And like, you can't really have a conversation about Machiavelli with it, but you can pet it on the head. I think the only sort of human origin AI that Beacon might be interested in is Silver Hyacinth. Because Silver Hyacinth is immensely old and has evolved to a monstrous level of complexity.
Also, this kind of flips the usual first contact stories, when like, usually in all these sci-fi movies and books and TV shows, it's like an alien comes down and is like, take me to your leader. And in this case, it's kind of reverse, where this incredibly intelligent being is like, okay, now I think I can deign to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, because think about it, right? A lot of space opera and a lot of sort of this first contact scenario, this idea of hostility right at the start, this idea of, oh, take me to your leader. Why, though? Because A, space is large, right? You have to work really hard to run into each other. There's plenty of ice, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of planets, so much metal. Like, space is the one place where you could be a hermit and just stick to your little corner and go, you know what, I'm not going to answer my emails. So the first question is, why would you be antagonistic when you could acquire water, metals, anything you need for civilization just by moving to the next solar system, and it's so much less hassle? And the second thing is, think of an ant on your breakfast plate. For all you know, it's sitting there, it's trying to summon you and going, oh, great God, I summoned you to deal with that cockroach over there. And you're just sitting there going, oh, it's an ant. And then you spot the cockroach and you go kill the cockroach. And then the ant probably goes back to its people and said, I have summoned this creature and it has done my bidding. I am now Lord and there's religion. But you really have no idea, right? And you're not going to spend time talking to the ant either because you're fighting with someone on Twitter. The motives and the levels in the information landscape that these creatures operate on are so fundamentally different that a part of my belief is that if you do find intelligence, the real danger is that you will not recognize it. We haven't even been good at recognizing it among ourselves. As humans, we've done extraordinary cruel things to each other based on the color of our skin or the different gods we worship or the different languages we speak or where we come from. And we consistently refuse to acknowledge clearly obvious humans as being our intellectual equals. So how would we deal with something that doesn't have that if we are so bad at understanding it among ourselves? This runs throughout the Salvage Crew. Like, why would you bother?
And speaking of humans doing horrible things to each other, colonialism is something that you keep coming back to in your work. And could you elaborate on why you find that so important to touch on in your writing?
It's interesting. Colonialism is something that I have a complex relationship with. Let's take, for example, myself. I'm speaking in English right now. I'm wearing jeans. I'm working on a computer. I have access to Google. And growing up, being at Isipatana, the school that I was in, I had friends who wanted to be writers. I had friends who wanted to go out and do great things. And we were all poor and we were sticking together. And a large part of the reason that I made it and many of them didn't, that is not because I was smart or more able. It's because I spoke English, the language of the colonizers, so to speak. And because of that, I could access resources and information. And I had a leg up on the rest of the world, if you will. And this is at the same time, colonialism is also something that every culture at every point in history has done to each other. There is no such thing as a pure culture. And I'm fascinated by how people respond to these imposition of these sometimes very cruel and immensely powerful systems that you can't fight against, but you have to hack around. If you look at the recent history of countries like Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's the history of countries that suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of these very powerful, tightly integrated military economic systems. And for many people, fighting it directly is impossible. But you hack through it, you find workarounds, you find chinks in the armor of these very large-scale systems, you infiltrate until you come to the point where you can lead a big march and say, get out of our country. So it's always been fascinating for me to explore that, partly because we are living in that reality. We are living in the aftermath of such a reality.
On a completely different note, though that was a lovely answer, thank you. I can't leave this conversation without bringing up Simon again.
He was fun to write. He was very fun to write.
He was absolutely my favorite because I was deeply intrigued and deeply horrified by the idea of a reality TV slave star.
Yep.
And you've also referenced reality TV, or rather it makes an appearance in your other work. Is there something about reality TV that has a hold on you?
Oh, it's something I'm constantly horrified by. Like shows like Survivor, but also all sorts of TV where this premise is, sort of the descendants of Big Brother, if you will. It's something that I'm truly horrified by. And I'm just as horrified by the fact that people buy into it, they put themselves through it. Because I have an odd relationship with sort of publicity, as if there are many things in my life that are very public and I put them on Twitter and Instagram and so on. There are also parts of my life that I keep very, very private. So it's always fascinating to me, this idea of an audience, this idea of a massive audience funneled towards a person in the guise of this artificial landscape, this setup, if you will, and how people react to that. And it's something that truly horrifies me. So that's why Simon has that trauma. That's why the Inhuman Race, that whole thing is a setup for a game show in Kandy. And I knew a fair few Simons growing up. I mean, the schools that I went to, people who had, not being TV reality stars, but who had immense fear and terror in their backgrounds. In cases like mine, it was sort of abusive families and so on. In cases of people that I knew, it was, you're coming from a family where your older brother is a drug dealer. There are lots of gangs hanging outside. One of the common themes I've consistently seen in them, in sometimes me as well, is this switch where you're sort of moaning around being a bit of a goof. And then there's this traumatic trigger that sends you completely into overdrive. Simon is an amalgamation of a lot of people. I think he might be the most real out of everyone there. There are elements of real people in all of them.
And before we wind up, please tell us more about the poetry. How did you decide on poetry as a plot device? And there's a wild mix of poets in here. And it takes on a serious significance later in the story. So how did you come up with that?
I love poetry. I wouldn't say I'm much of a poet, but it's something that I've always been fascinated by. I think one of the best arguments I've had in my life was with this mathematician who had given up mathematics. I think his PhD was in algebraic topology to translate Borges. He was frustrated with the existing translations, and we found that our definitions of poetry differed widely. His definition was poetry is the capturing of intricate emotion And my approach to it was, it is a system where the order of and placement of words capture more than just a sequence that those syllables imply. If you take like Bertrand Russell's rather incomplete thesis of all language being a way of denoting concepts and the relationships between them. Now, that's not a complete theory of language, but just for the purposes of this, you could look upon a poem as something where the arrangement of words in space, in these two dimensions, also adds an extra layer of meaning, concepts, and the relationships between them. I've always been a fan of various types of poetry, and the inclusion of Tang Dynasty poetries, because I felt that sort of Du Fu, Li Bai, and others, they did there's this wonderful style there of capturing this fleeting moment, sort of freezing it and framing it. Then there's Tennyson there. There's Ulysses by Tennyson, which is my favorite poem in the world.
Oh, mine too, by the way.
Oh, nice. I actually have a tattoo on one arm that has the sort of worn-out Ulysses pondering in front of a sketch of Troy with the Trojan horse in front. And this idea of it little profits an idle king to sit here and mete out unequal laws unto a savage race. Like, I've become a name for always roaming the hungry heart, much I have seen, blah, blah, blah. But all experience is an arch, where through gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades, forever and ever as I move. I love that. This idea that there is so much more to the world than you expect to be. This idea of experience being an arch through which gleams that untraveled world. The idea that you can forever keep moving. And wherever you go, whichever direction you move, you will find new things to see. And I think Tennyson says like how dull it is to pause, to make a rest, to rust unburnished and not shine in use. I loved that. And it felt like something that Bacon would say to a kindred intelligence. It would describe, because Bacon is very much a polytropos in the truest sense of the word, a thing of twists and turns. And to signify that it is old, it is ancient really, it's still looking for something, it's still open to new experiences, taking it to new worlds. It's still out there, it's not tired of the world yet. I love that theme. I love that, and that it comes with this implication of hunger as well, because one of the interesting things about Odysseus / Tennyson's Ulysses is like there's a hunger about him and a restlessness. Where he realizes that, yes, he did all of these things to get home, but now that he's home, he's realized that he actually had more meaning and purpose being lost and wandering the world in search of new horizons. There's a sense of that about Bacon, so that's why that particular poem is there.
One last question before I let you go. Do you have any new or recent projects that you'd like to shout out? What can we look forward to in 2023?
Oof, answering that is terrifying. I am working on a novel called Origami Meteorite, which is about musicians. It's completely different from everything I've written. It's about musicians in a post-climate change world. And I thought when I started writing it that it would be done by now. Instead, I'm 75,000 words in and we are on chapter 2. This sort of feels like, Captain Ahab and the whale is a lot larger than I ever expected to be. And I'm here going, oh no, what have I done? I do need to finish the last book of the Commonwealth Empire's trilogy. That's the Inhuman War. I'm in that process of doing the research for it. I'm also, for fun, writing a story about a giant orange cat bossing a paladin around. And that's mostly because I like cats. And that particular story is being sent to the moon, like the actual moon, in the Astrobotica Peregrine lander. But this is mostly because I like orange cats. And I'm having a little bit of fun exploring the tropes of fantasy and flipping them over. But I don't have a set date for any of these things, unfortunately.
Well, at least we know what to look for. And also, orange cats are the best cats. People can fight me on this, but...
Yes, they have one brain cell, but it's so cute when they get to that time of the week where they can use that one brain cell.
That is the most perfect description of orange cats I've ever heard. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Yudhanjaya. And thank you so much for being on ARCS. We loved having you, and this was a wonderful, thoughtful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Arcs is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.